The webinar CPG Innovation in 2025, Unlocking the Tipping Point, Sustainability, Health, and Packaging. My name is Josh Haslam, Senior Director here at Lux Research, and I'll be moderating today's session. Presenting today are my colleagues Harini Venkatramana, Associate Research Director, Nardev Ramanathan, Associate Research Director, and Matilda Della Fontana, Analyst here at Lux. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you have in the questions box on the screen. Time permitting, we'll answer all the questions that we can. If your question doesn't get answered, please don't hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we'll respond. If at any point you experience technical difficulties, such as a frozen screen, simply refresh your browser and check that your internet connection is strong. With that, let's go ahead and jump into the presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Josh, and good day to everyone here. I'm really excited to talk to you about how we're thinking about CPG innovation in 2025, unlocking the tipping point in sustainability, health, and packaging. I'm really excited to be joined by my colleagues here, Harini Venkataraman and Matilde Della Fontana. Now, before we get started, I think it's important to sort of understand some of the pressing issues or challenges, if you will, right, that's I think facing many different CPG organizations globally. Firstly, the regulatory landscape around sustainability. Now, the several regulations are shaping the sustainability efforts in the CPG industry. For instance, the EU's regulation on deforestation-free products mandates that commodities imported into the EU must be deforestation-free. Additionally, the EU's ESG reporting rules require companies to report on various environmental factors, including greenhouse gas emissions and resource use. These regulations are putting pressure on CPG companies to adopt more sustainable practices and to enhance their reporting capabilities. Next, we have the explosion of AI growth, advance in AI capabilities, notably in LLM, generative AI, ChatGPT, unlocked new ways of engaging with consumers. But it has also created uncertainties and a lack of clarity as to how to best leverage these technologies from R&D to product development and even internal operations to get really good value out of it. And the third is supply chain disruptions. Extreme weather events and other disruptions are increasingly impacting supply chains. CPG companies are focusing on building resilience by adopting sustainable sourcing practices and improving supply chain transparency. This includes monitoring and reporting on environmental impacts such as carbon emissions and water use to comply with the regulatory requirements and to meet consumer expectations. And these are also creating challenges for CPG companies. So in the face of all those potential challenges and uncertainties, how can you leverage tipping points for competitive advantage? And this is what we're going to talk to you today about. And of course, given the time, we could go on talking about this all day, but in the interest of time, we're going to focus on three main pillars. Consumer health, which I will get us started on, and then we'll talk about sustainable ingredients, which my colleague Harini will lead that discussion, followed by packaging innovation led by Matilde. So we'll focus on these three main pillars for today. So let's get started on consumer health. Now, an important tipping point I really like to highlight today for consumer health is the technology that's called contactless biosensing. What is that? It's essentially biosensing without making any bodily contact, right? It's the next generation of consumer health monitoring. And if you look at the kind of tools you have, they're mostly contact-based, right? We talk about your smart watches and your other sort of health patches, your smart rings. They're mostly contact-based. Now, on your right screen, right of the screen, you will see what we have, which is the text signal. The text signal is a tool that we use at Lux to really highlight the innovation momentum in the space. It takes into account 5 different kinds of data sets and condenses that into this space. And that is essentially patent data, VC funding data, academic funding data, government funding data, academic research, and our own Lux proprietary data. And it is then kind of mapped onto the average of all the different technologies that we track that you can see on the gray signal here. And what you can see is that the innovation momentum overall is trending pretty well. There was a slight dip around 2020, but overall, it's starting to show good trajectory again the last few years, right? So really an interesting technology to watch out here from an innovation momentum, from what the data tells us. Now, consumer wearables, of course, today you're probably wondering, well, they're kind of doing pretty well, right? Like, why is contactless biosensing going to be, the next generation, and how is it going to really create that impact? Consumer wearables today have 2 main issues that they have to contend with. Firstly, retention rates. They can drop very quickly by as much as 50% within 6 months. And there's data showing how users, for example, using Fitbit, within 6 months, 50% of users tend to stop using it on a regular basis. And they're not really suitable for all groups, right? Especially if you think about, let's say children, babies, you may not really necessarily want to have them wear wearables, right? If you want to track their health. Or if you're talking about folks who are elderly, who are sort of having dementia, they may not be folks who might regularly be able to use it, for obvious reasons, or they might just not want to use wearables, right? So contactless biosensing can address all of this, and I think it's an interesting technology to watch here. Now, from a market perspective, the landscape can be divided into 3 main types of technologies. Facial biometrics, which is essentially any kind of technology that looks to capture information from your face, obviously, but using either cameras or short videos captured from cameras to collect information there. The second is voice-based biomarkers, typically using microphones from your smartphones, your personal devices, capturing vital signs there, right, that can potentially predict disease. And I'll talk about that in a case study later. And last but not least, passive monitoring. So any kind of technology that's passively monitoring, your sort of, your vitals or your movement. There's some technologies that are using radio frequency, for example, material technologies there that map that looks to capture micro vibrations, let's say, from your body. So that are some emerging technologies in this space. Now, from a timeline perspective, there are, of course, a number of different activities in the last couple of years. I won't go through each of them here, but really the key takeaway from this slide is to kind of point out that there is, consistent activity throughout these different players in this space, mostly centered around partnerships, centered around, validation. And again, I'll talk about that very shortly. And also securing, regulatory approval in one case at least, right? So there are a number of different kind of activities going on in the last couple of years. Now, as I mentioned, I do want to talk about, a case study here where Mayo Clinic, right, very, renowned clinical institution, and Click Health developed a voice-based biomarker for diabetes detection, right? And the idea is that they used a 10-second voice recording, and they showed that they were able to predict type 2 diabetes with over 85% accuracy, right? And when you look at the right here, this chart, you'll see that it compares, pretty favorably, I would say, across current ways of detecting diabetes with fasting blood glucose sort of measurements, or HbA1c, or oral glucose tolerance tests. Of course, some of these are above 90%, but it's not far off, right? When you look at sort of that 80, 86 to 89% here from these voice-based detection. And the vocal changes they found was manifested differently in men and women, and they had slightly different results as a result as well. And of course, while the findings are promising, the actual study was done around 200 sort of subjects there. Of course, you need larger scale studies to validate that. But I think this is a good start, right? And it's promising when you think about, these sort of, cutting edge technologies that can make, this testing simple and easy, right? And so this is, I think, one kind of contactless biosensing technology that could be very interesting to watch out here. Now, despite the promise of contactless biosensing, the current landscape of available players is still quite sparse, as I mentioned earlier, because it's an early technology. But companies are beginning to penetrate the market. We've seen the innovation momentum to the tech signal. There is interest, there is activity going on, and this is a really interesting sort of tipping point, right, to take note of as you're thinking about that, early opportunity here. Data privacy concerns are also there, talking about voice and facial data, so that may potentially slow penetration. But keep an eye out on these early use cases and definitely look for opportunities through larger ecosystem partnerships. And with that, I will hand it over to my colleague Harini to talk to you about sustainable ingredients. Over to you, Harini.
Thank you so much, Nurdev, and a great start to that CPG innovation ecosystem that you mentioned, right? I think we started with consumer health. We're going to shift gears and talk a little bit about sustainable ingredients. And I know for the audience here, a lot of you, it's top of mind in terms of thinking about what's next on the ingredient production, specifically the supply chain disruptions that they've brought up. I think has created a lot of momentum around sustainable and alternative production methodologies. The one technology that I wanted to highlight today is around CO2 to ingredients. So pretty much using CO2 as a feedstock, moving away from the traditional, sugar and glucose-based feedstocks and going into using a gas fermentation methodology to be able to convert that CO2 into a protein biomass. It's not only microbial, it can also be done through electrochemical methodologies where you don't have any microorganisms, although today the industry is dominated by a lot of the microbial fermentation methodologies there. I think some of the great drivers for this particular technology, but overall, let's say the climate challenged ingredient side is really the potential to be able to decarbonize, but also address the sustainable food production. I think that is one of the bigger drivers for CPG industries. To think about how can they sustainably source, but also future-proof some of their important raw materials. As Nurdev pointed out, we do have a Lux Tech signal for CO2 to ingredients here, and you can see that this technology in itself has been around for quite some years there because hydrogen oxidizing bacteria are nothing new. But interestingly, the tipping point that I wanted to just highlight here is around the period of 2020-21. That is when we saw a tangible, I would say, startup community building around CO2 to ingredients. It was also the same time we witnessed a bit of VC funding going into the space. And over the past 4 years, I guess we've come a bit further away and evolved from that initial 1 to 2 startups like Solar Foods, which I'll be talking about. Today, this is a fast-growing industry, I would say, but still it's a part of that bigger toolbox when you think about making the sustainable ingredients. And specifically using CO2 as a feedstock, you could actually go into 2 different target molecules. The reason I'm highlighting is that a lot of the technology underpinning CO2 to ingredients is kind of dictated by the target molecules and the applications that these developers are focusing on. So proteins is no surprise, coming up as one of the biggest target areas. And again, you'll see that this is still dominated by a lot of startups today. But we are beginning to see some first movers like the ADM, Novonesis, for example. They all have been investing quite a bit, but also partnering into the CO2 to ingredient space. The second aspect of this is to make lipids. It could be fats, oils, or individual fatty acids using CO2 as a feedstock. But as you can see from our market map of innovators, this is still a very, very niche space, and it's still very much emerging. Proteins would be by far the biggest target, and I would say that a lot of the developments related to proteins would underpin as how much of this lipids would also be taken up in the future. So from the startup perspective, I think the number of players, as I mentioned, still looking at microbial routes, which means they're using either a hydrogen oxidizing bacteria in the native form as it is, or they could do genetic engineering to either improve some of the conversion rates. One thing to keep in mind is that for CO2 to ingredients, specifically using gas fermentation methodology, you do need other types of inputs too. For example, hydrogen is an important parameter there, and you need to make sure that hydrogen is cost effective. A lot of developers want to use green hydrogen, as we all know, with the energy costs rising up. Green hydrogen is not something very much feasible in terms of getting it to the cost parity with incumbent ingredients. But there are a lot of efforts in terms of making sure how this whole ecosystem can develop. And I'll highlight one or two case studies in terms of how some of these companies are partnering as well. Before doing so, just to take a very quick look at key events. In terms of this technology, as I mentioned, the tipping point has, been around 2021 timeframe, and ever since we're seeing a fair bit of momentum. But a lot of that is attributable to VC funding going into the space. We're not seeing a ton of money going there. It's still about like seed funding or early stage funding, but a good tangible data point to say that this is evolving as another category in itself. For example, we did see Solar Foods being one of the first movers able to gain quite a bit of funding, about 8 million. Again, not a lot when you compare with some of the other areas where we have seen multi-million dollar rounds before too. But given the food tech's investment scenario and VCs getting very, very selective, I think this is still a good data point in terms of how CO2 to ingredients are able to get at least some funding. We're also seeing some product launches. For example, Facer, which is a pretty well-known company here in Europe, they launched chocolate snack bars containing some of these gas fermentation-derived proteins. We're also seeing some energy involvement. Woodside Energy is a well-known player, and they actually led one of the Series A rounds of Nova Nutrients. I think that is exactly what I was mentioning in terms of how do you create that ecosystem where you bring in not just the energy players, but also like really creating processing players as well as other types of downstream players who could all help create a path forward for these startups. Last but not the least, I know pretty recent and definitely something to highlight is industry top mover, LanzaTech. They've been working a lot on CO2 utilization, but they have now expanded their gas fermentation platform for producing both food and feed proteins. This is definitely going to take some time in terms of them being able to scale up, but still a very good sign in terms of seeing that potential for CO2 as a feedstock. Let me just talk a little bit about one recent case study. Solar Foods partnered with Ajinomoto, a very well-known Japanese food company there. And here the whole idea is to be able to, think about launching some of those first products. In this case, they were flowering mooncakes and ice cream sandwiches, which were actually formulated using solein. And solein is the first CO2-derived protein from Solar Foods. They just got the regulatory approval in Singapore. And it's also important to notice that the regulatory approval in APAC has a favorable landscape right now, and we got to wait and see how this will be translated to Europe and other parts of the world as well. It's an important take here is that a Solar Food does have the first mover advantage, but the reality is that even at the scale at which they're operating is not going to be enough to reach the cost parity. I think moving away from just the novel of, let's say, pilot products and to be able to create a supply chain that could be reliable for bigger CPGs, I think that is the big challenge and the question here. And we'll be seeing a lot more of developments going into 2025 and beyond in terms of creating a diverse toolbox of sustainable ingredients. And today I talked a bit about CO2 to ingredients. Given the time, I think we have a wealth of research related to proteins and fats and other types of raw materials going into a lot of the CPG supply chains. I think one big takeaway here is also that you have to think about a roadmap and create that for important raw materials, right? And that could be really in terms of taking into account the policy and regulations, pretty much predicting it, I would even say. And if there are areas in which you already see alternative ingredients playing a role, I think the investment should go there. So just to finish up there, CO2 to ingredients is still at that early tipping point stage, and things going to take quite some time to be able to go into commercial widespread adoption. But I think it's an early weeks signal that you don't want to miss out on. I guess I'm going to pass it on to my colleague Matilda to talk a bit about packaging innovations there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rini. And yeah, great discussion so far. And I think that when we talk about tipping point in CPG, we can talk about packaging, right? Because over the past year, many brands and the industry, right, have faced increased scrutiny over their packaging practice and in relation to, accumulation of plastic waste, release of microplastic, or even increased carbon footprint of the products they use, but also the product they pack. So I want to start approaching the tipping innovation point in the packaging sector with a story. If we look at the Luxtag signal, we can see that there has been a steady growth since 2018, 2019. And there is when the Ellen MacArthur Foundation back in 2019, 18, apologies, launched the New Plastic Economy Global Commitment that really catalyzed an industry-wide pledge to achieve 100% recyclable, compostable, reusable packaging. But at the same time, really aim to reduce reliance on virgin plastic and increase the use of post-consumer recycled content into packaging. However, I don't know if you remember, but in 2022, little progress had been made towards this commitment, with many brands struggling to find a path to meeting their targets. And in 2023, we saw the landscape began to shift with renewed efforts among CPG companies and their supply chain partners to advance different packaging initiatives. Now, in 2024, with 1 year left on the clock to 2025, we are seeing several companies reassessing their strategy, adjusting timelines, like in the case of Colgate-Palmolive or Unilever, and revising objectives to be more realistic and to better align with the evolving packaging landscape. And for me, the tipping point in packaging innovation is happening now, because you can see that steady growth really highlights that there are additional needs for innovation and packaging design. That doesn't mean there is not innovation activity, but innovation in packaging is really difficult due to the scale of packaging industry, extreme price sensitivity, and strict performance requirement, right? So to navigate this complex landscape, companies really need to understand where innovation can meet the performance requirements of regulation mandates and at the same time sustainability gains. And if you look at the space from a market perspective, you can see that there is no one-size-fits-all solution, right? There are different approaches to improve packaging sustainability, and at Lux, we did this exercise to try to categorize this technology based on the material composition and also function. For example, the space on pulp and paper packaging really involves the conversion of fibers into usable packaging structure. And here innovation really lies in advances in process efficiency or the use of non-wood fibers and waste stream for pulp making. And if you look at the landscape of players, we have a mix of corporations like Amcor, Huhtamäki, and Mondi, but at the same time, emerging startup like Pulpap and Yangi trying to commercialize dry molding technology, or even like players like Pabaco and Pulpex that are scaling up paper bottle technologies. If we then shift to the space of monomaterial packaging, right, here innovation really focus on try to create this single material substrate. And we have like companies trying to develop new plastic resin grade, other focusing on cavitation or foaming plastic technology, and other really like focusing on the creation of this oriented monomaterial film with company like Nova Chemical and Sabic. But it's also like quite common that big corporations are supporting through their like venture arm emerging startup, like in the case of Void Technology with the support of Kimberly-Clark and Sabic Venture. If you look at the space of compostable packaging, I say there is a lot of material diversity there, but usually these players are using material that are being targeted for their claimed compostability, water solubility, or potential to be edible, right? And we see players like CJ Bio or Danimer Scientific really like trying to commercialize polydroxyalkylinates-based packaging to the market, or startups like Nopla, Flexi, and Sway that are trying to bring seaweed-based material or protein-based material to the market. And lastly, we have the space of barrier solution that is really like, pivotal for the adoption of any other type of packaging innovation, right? Because here we really like focus on the production of coating additives or binders that improve or impart the barrier property to the packaging substrate that are fundamental to then protect the goods inside the packaging. So as I was mentioning, there is a lot of diversity. And if we reflect back on what happened over the past year, right, and we look a little bit of the timeline of key events, I think it's quite clear that this novel consumer packaging material are under development, with project targeting, a technology readiness level of 5 to 7, 8 in the next 5 years. And in the past year, we have seen a lot of, VC funding announcement with startup like Infinite Nanotech raising money, or collaboration between big corporation and startup, like in the case of Mondi and Traceless, or few scale-up announcement, like in the case of Sampla and Pabaco. And I would love to tell you more, so if there are questions about any of this specific event, happy to take them at the end. Among all this, newer technology, there is a set of technology that I like to highlight and bring up the case study and example of Zotefoam. So the technology of Zotefoam is not necessarily a new technology, but is something that is becoming increasingly important for the packaging sector, because it allows the reduction of material usage while maintaining the same performance requirement. So Zotefoam is a UK-based material manufacturer that has developed a recyclable, high-density polyethylene cellular technology for beverage carton called Resources. So the technology really produced this white high-density polyethylene polymer sheet with foam layer inside that are created by saturating the polymer with nitrogen. As a result, you need to use less material to create this packaging wall. And the company is positioning them as a replacement for traditional beverage cartons, claiming great efficiency in terms of, water use, energy use, but also in terms of carbon emission when compared to the incumbent solution they're trying to replace. So at the time when companies are required really to comply with global recyclability standards and reduce the carbon footprint, a solution like the one of Zotephone seems to alleviate the strain on companies' commitment, right? It's important to note that, however, although the company has already established partnership for producing the packaging and started market trials, it will be critical to understand how the technology can be implemented into existing manufacturing line, and costs also remain unknown. And they will be a significant element in fully understanding the technology adoption. So this is just one of the case study example that we are seeing happening in the last few months. But to reflect back a little bit, right? I think that the tipping view and the perception of the packaging sector is really that the sustainability alone is no longer a differentiator, is a requirement, but also packaging must also meet performance standards. And we also have seen that simple changes such as removing unnecessary wrapping or thinning out packaging wall are often more effective than announcing the intent to pilot 100% bio-based polyethylene packaging, which, while drawing immediate attention, offer less immediate impact, right? Recent years have really shown that being realistic and tangible about what can be achieved is crucial for future progress. And lastly, really, we know that policy and regulation impacting packaging vary significantly across the region. But it seems that recycled plastic is the safest best for sustainable packaging in this moment, because there is a high level of global consensus supporting its use. So we're expecting CPG brands really to prioritize packaging recyclability in their strategy to ensure long-term viability and compliance with the regulation set to take effect by 2030.
Yeah, thanks all. That's some really deep insight today. And just to lead us in, you guys have left us with outlooks for what the future looks like. But if you were to leave everybody here with a specific takeaway, something to say, this is what you need to watch out for. This is what's coming. What would you start out with? And we'll start here with Nardev on health.
Yeah, thanks, Josh. I would say that firstly, there are opportunities on the horizon for contactless biosensing. It's early, it's still emerging, but it is showing an early promise in the market. And I think it's a good tipping point to really keep the back of all your minds as you're looking at this space. In 2025, pilot programs for specific use cases. I talked about diabetes, but there are other kind of areas as well, looking at general wellness and even cognitive health, which are worth exploring to demonstrate feasibility and prove the value of contactless biosensing solutions before you really go deeper.
Great. If we're to pass it on down the line here, what about for ingredients, Harini?
Absolutely. I think we touched a little bit upon that kind of future forward-looking CO2 to ingredients, but the reality is that ingredient companies, as well as CPG clients, you need to think about both short-term gains and long-term growth, which means sustainable ingredients will become an important aspect of your diversified portfolio, but your strategy can be different, right? In the near term, you could tap into sustainable sourcing, agriculture-based technologies, regenerative agriculture. But in the longer term, you really need to think about how can I create that portfolio, right? It could be microbial, it could be electrochemical, or it could be really coming from another feedstock. But it's essential to already assess that and strengthen the R&D, but also seek partnerships where needed.
Right on, right on. And then lastly, coming back to packaging, Matilda.
Yeah, no, there would be a lot, of great takeaways, but I feel that the most important one is really like we're gonna see CPG brands really be more strategic in their circularity goals and commitments. And this because we mentioned that before, but packaging goals shouldn't be universal, right? Each company will set and need to set the targets based on its specific packaging portfolio and available internal resources as well. For example, a company with heavy business in PET and high-density polyethylene rigid plastic, for example, that have higher recycling rates than more problematic material like flexible packaging are better positioned to meet their circularity goals. So we are really expecting brands to strategically reassess and shift deadlines of their packaging targets to target then 2030, 2035 timelines.
Excellent. Well, as I said, thanks all. We're now going to be taking some questions that you have for the presentation. So if you can, type them into the box. I'll take a look and see some. If we do get your question on this call, someone at Lux will be in touch after the webinar to contact you and see if we can't address that, offline with an analyst. But to kind of end out here, I know we're tight on time today because you guys really laid out the situation. I'm going to go ahead and start with something I think that's been on some folks' minds recently. And Harini, you kind of talked about this a little bit. Climate is an issue. Climate challenged ingredients are something to really be thinking about for a lot of companies, whether it's cost, whether it's price, whether it's alternatives. What other sort of alternative production technologies are emerging and, outside of what we talked about today, perhaps, that can help solve some of these climate challenge ingredient issues that are arising and becoming, I think, more of a concern recently?
Absolutely. I think there is still quite a bit of innovation going around, like green extraction methodologies, although that's relying still on agriculture supply chain. But if you think about real alternatives, there's kind of a suite of technologies, right? You have precision fermentation, and you can also do like the biomass fermentation where you do not actually genetically engineer the microorganisms. There's also molecular farming, which we are looking at very closely. There's a ton of startups that have just started focusing on commodities like coffee, cocoa, and knowing that the cocoa prices are shooting out of the roof, I would imagine that that's something which a lot of companies are looking at. And last but not the least is also like, AI-driven processes where you can actually really expedite the reformulation of some of those with existing regulatory approved ingredients. So definitely there's a wide range of those beyond what I presented today.
Excellent. Well, I think that's a good stopping point. You touched on a lot of different technologies there today. So I'd like to just say thanks all. That concludes our webinar for today. The slide presentation, the recording for this webinar will all be sent to you for those who listened in. After leaving the webinar, you're going to be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. So we'd love to get that feedback. Helps us inform and improve our future webinars. And then lastly, please take a moment and do check out our upcoming webinars. We have them monthly. So thanks for joining us and have a great day.